Well, it started last year with the March break that didn't end, that a whole generation of students graduated virtually. And then here in 2021, we had a similar situation happen where the school year ended a bit prematurely because of a concern over COVID-19. I think that is, it's worth noting that this isn't just here. It's obviously something that's impacted the world. In fact, the relative value, I'm reading from a report here, the relative value of closing schools for the physical health of individuals has been contrasted against the potential benefits of keeping schools open for children's social development and education and to enable full economic recovery. Another key factor to consider lies in the consequences of social or school closures on the parents' mental health and substance use. Talking about using that word pivoting to homeschooling. Dalhousie professor says mandatory homeschooling is doing more harm than good, and that mandatory homeschooling linked to emotional distress and substance misuse is something for us to be, concerned about. Dr. Simon Sherry is a clinical psychologist and professor of the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience at Dalhousie University, and we have him here with us this afternoon. Dr. Sherry, it's good to see you again.
Good to see you as well, Sheldon.
When we're talking about this report, and let's acknowledge there are others who are helping you draft this report and put this document together, that mandatory homeschooling obviously is an option that governments have chosen, and that based on what you're telling us, there are two competing theories here as to what might happen. What might that outcome be? What is the effect possible on our parents and our kids?
Our research joins a wider body of research suggesting that mandatory homeschooling creates emotional distress and substance misuse among parents. In particular, we showed that mandatory homeschooling results in anxiety and depression among parents. Not surprisingly, we also found that parents required to homeschool were using alcohol and cannabis more frequently in an effort to cope with their anxiety and depression.
How are you able to know this?
During wave one of the pandemic, we studied approximately 760 couples from across Canada, and a meaningful subset of those couples were involved in mandatory homeschooling. One interesting thing we were able to show is that the more hours a parent was involved in mandatory homeschooling, the more emotional distress and substance misuse they reported. In other words, there seems to be a dose-response relationship between mandatory homeschooling and subsequent mental health difficulties.
We know that this is focusing on the parents, and I know it's been a long time since I graduated from school, and my kids are now long since out of elementary school, and I can only imagine how much of a challenge it will be based on the changing curricula, the varieties of way that learning advances and changes over time. The fact, though, that this is impacting parent-child relationships and interactions, as you call it, what can you tell us about that?
I don't think parents are failing here. I don't think children are failing here. I certainly don't think teachers are failing here. Parents care enormously about their children, and my observation is that overwhelmingly teachers care about their students. The failure here, Sheldon, is one of policy. We have prescribed to our population the closure of schools and mandatory homeschooling. And mandatory homeschooling is a breeding ground for parent-child dysfunction. Research suggests, done by a research team other than my own, that there's a much more negativity in parent-child interactions and much less positivity in parent-child interactions when mandatory homeschooling is required. In my own house, where I have a kid in grade 6, Tony Robbins couldn't motivate that kid to care about math or French right now. It's an extremely difficult thing to be a teacher to your own kid. And part of the problem here, Sheldon, is what I would call role strain. You've already got parents who are partners and employees and friends and have additional required responsibilities and roles. And then involuntarily, they have dropped into their life the new and particularly demanding role of teachers. And that is a lot of strain to have so many roles on the go amid a pandemic.
Does this affect the moms and the dads differently? I know you talk about that role strain. The New York Times article that's cited in that news release suggests that men, at least in this study in the United States, feel that they're doing half the work, but moms would say that half is about 3%. Dads need work. He's going to need work on math skills as well.
There's a problem and an opportunity here. Mandatory homeschooling seems to be landing disproportionately in the laps of women. And this is troubling in that it's going to exacerbate pre-existing social inequalities. In other words, several studies have converged to suggest that women are disproportionately bearing the burden of mandatory homeschooling during the pandemic. That's the problem. Here's the opportunity. The opportunity is there for those dads who are not already to step up, to man up, and to do more when it comes to mandatory homeschooling. And it is encouraging that research would suggest that when dads are more involved in mandatory homeschooling, the family is less stressed and there's less conflict at home.
When we take a deep look at this, a hard look at this, and you're talking about government policy that has put us on this path, and you describe tunnel vision in this report, the tunnel vision of those policymakers. Can you extrapolate? Can you explain that to me?
For months, we've had in Nova Scotia an overly narrow focus on preventing COVID-19. We emphasize the benefits of lockdowns, we emphasize the benefits of restrictions, and we haven't looked at the harms of the lockdowns and the restrictions. Clearly, we need to be focusing on containing COVID-19, and I respect and follow public health guidance. But we've developed a narrative where we're succeeding here in Nova Scotia. The idea being that we're successful in containing COVID-19. But that narrative doesn't survive close scrutiny because the policies we're following, the actions we're taking are generating mental illness among children and parents. A policy like mandatory homeschooling is actually a form of iatrogenic illness. It's a prescription written by a doctor to a patient that's making that patient ill. In this case, the patients are the parents of Nova Scotia. And when you write a well-intentioned prescription that results in harm, you should quickly abandon that prescription in favor of stopping the harm that's being caused.
Dr. Simon Sherry, what are you asking for? Are you saying that based on the evidence that we should just say if you can't be in class that kids shouldn't be homeschooled at all?
If we can't open schools, if we lack the stomach and the conviction to take the risk to open schools, then we should stop pretending that learning is occurring through mandatory homeschooling, and we should shut down mandatory homeschooling. Now, if our government refuses to do so, I would advise parents to care less and to do less when it comes to mandatory homeschooling. Less is more when it comes to mandatory homeschooling. I would encourage parents to invest in their socially and emotionally malnourished children, and rather than fighting over Zoom and math, which will soon be forgotten if it was ever retained to begin with, I would, within the public health guidance, participate in leisure and play and fun and recreation and adventure, and invest your time in something that will be more fruitful for you and your relationship with your kid.
How do you feel this position, those statements will resonate with teachers and maybe even the teachers union representing those teachers?
I respect our teachers. I don't think they're failing. This is a policy that's failing, not our teachers. I think our teachers care enormously. And I think a candid conversation with many of them would suggest that mandatory homeschooling is a failed policy. Our teachers are doing a great job, but they're participating in a futile policy.
I've heard concern from other parents in some news reports saying last year was tough, this year is tougher, and that some parents want their children to repeat the grade, that in their best interest, as in their educational career, if you want to put it that way, that they would be better served to go back and repeat the grade that they're in this year. Just curious how that squares with what you're describing and discussing here.
Sheldon, learning loss is an enormous concern here, and it may very well take serious efforts to address learning loss that's occurring across phase 1, 2, and 3 of the pandemic. My point would be that little or no progress is being made through mandatory homeschooling, and that mandatory homeschooling is not a vehicle to prevent learning loss. Rather, there's unanimous evidence to suggest that mandatory homeschooling is a breeding ground for emotional distress in parents, children, and their relationships.
There will likely be a provincial election in Nova Scotia before long. And I know this conversation started with the impact of homeschooling, and not on the pupil, but on the caregiver. And you mentioned increased use of alcohol and cannabis as mechanisms of coping, or as some people would say, to deal with the added stress. I'm wondering how you feel about the government's announcement just today that they've put in place the first chief officer, the Office of Mental Health and Addictions, Dr. Sam Hickox, who's been given that role. Any thoughts on this move at this time?
I think that there's promise in that appointment, but unless it's backed by money and timelines that would allow someone in that leadership position to make real progress, then it's merely a charade. If you look in Nova Scotia, we have not invested in mental health and addictions in proportion to the size of the problem in our province. In fact, in comparison to every other province in Canada, we've invested less in mental health over the last decade. So I'll be impressed if this minister is supported by real timelines with real budgets that would allow for real change.
You've given us a lot to chew on here, Simon. Dr. Sherry, I want to ask what, on a moving forward basis, on a positive or perhaps productive level, what you're telling moms and dads and caregivers right now based on what we've just talked about.
I would tell them that I understand mandatory homeschooling is enormously painful. I understand that parents love and support their children. And there are few things as exquisitely painful as feeling that you're failing your own child. This is not a failure of children or parents or teachers. This is a policy failure. The prescription written for mandatory homeschooling has failed. If we are required to limp through life and continue the charade that our children are actually learning through mandatory homeschooling, then I would advise fathers to participate more if they're not already. I would advise parents not to lean so heavily on cannabis and alcohol to cope, because that solution eventually becomes a problem. I would invite our leaders to consider that school closures and their costs may very well outweigh the benefits to COVID-19 prevention. And I would say, as soon as possible, do the humane and appropriate thing and end mandatory homeschooling. It's doing more harm than good.
It is always a pleasure to speak with you. He is Dr. Simon Sherry, clinical psychologist, a professor in the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience at Dalhousie University, and a parent himself. Dr. Sherry, thank you.
Thank you for your time, Sheldon.